Okay, this tutorial is going to explain how to read in a CSV file from memory, back in storage into working memory. So the first thing you need to be aware of is where your CSV file should be stored. Remember, CSV file is just a comma separated variable file. So it's just a simple text file, if you like, something you can create in a program like Notepad, and it just has data separated by little commas. So typically you would store that file in your bin debug folder, and the reason why it's stored in there is because whenever you compile your program.cs file, it creates an executable version of the program and stores it in the bin debug folder. And your user CSV file is stored in the same place, just for ease of access. And it means you can reference it in your variables, in your string path variable, just as you see here. So that's stored in there, and you can see show all files by clicking on this little icon here in your Solution Explorer. So now to the actual code itself. So you're going to need I should first of all say that this is a standalone program to read in the users. You'll have this as part of potentially a class, or certainly integrated as part of your solution in your coursework application. So the first thing is this variable here. This is the string path variable, and it is just basically telling the program where the file is stored. Now in this case, it's stored in the same folder as the executable file, so it's just users.csv, the name of the file. Then we have a one-dimensional array, and this one-dimensional array will essentially store all the users temporarily in transition from back in storage into your two-dimensional array. So this will store them as a sort of temporary store until you can chop them up and allocate them to the each data coordinate in your two-dimensional array. So I'm initializing this one-dimensional string array to the number of rows from the CSV file. So this little bit of code then just checks the number of lines, or reads the number of lines, and that gets the length. So that will initialize this one-dimensional array to the number of rows in the CSV file. This variable then just sets the number of students equal to the users.length. So it's that array, the number of rows. I guess I could have set it to this variable here, but again, I'm just showing you different ways of getting the same value. This then shows the number of columns, if you like, the number of bits of info in the CSV file. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I'm declaring that because that will be useful going forward, and that won't change. The number of rows might change, the number of users might change, but the number of bits of info will stay the same. Then we have the actual two-dimensional array itself, and the two-dimensional array is essentially what you'll be using throughout your, I guess, the working life of your program. And whenever you read it in from back in storage, you will initially store it in this array, and then you'll chop it up by commas and store it in this array. And this is a two-dimensional array as denoted by the comma in the square brackets after the string. And then in terms of the size of it, this is going to be number of students or no students, number of students in length, or the number of rows, and number of bits of info in width, or the number of columns. So we'll have number of students as rows and number of bits of info as columns. So that, based on this, that would be 4 students in terms of number of rows, and 10 columns in terms of the number of fields. So now we're into the main method, and the main method essentially will, in this case, we'll just run the program, just read it in, that's all it does. So we'll put a try catch around it. A try catch is an error handling mechanism. It means if there are any issues, any exceptions thrown for input output, that it will be caught, and then an appropriate exception used to handle that exception. So this exception class inherits from the exception base class. It's a file not found exception. It means the program won't crash. But any issue then is captured in this object, and then I'm just outputting it to string and handling it accordingly. I guess I should also mention, I forgot to mention at the outset, that you will need using system.io. You'll need to add that using statement at the outset and import that library into the program. You will need it for any input-output operations, including this file class that you'll need to read all the lines in initially. So then we are into the try users. So that one-dimensional array is reading all the lines in from the file at that path. So that's reading in each of these lines here. So that's 4 lines it's reading in, and it just reads them in. That's treated as a single string in row 0, a single string in row 1, a single string in row 2, and so on. Then we're creating another temporary array, and this temporary array is going to store each row as we migrate the information from the one-dimensional array into a two-dimensional array. So this is going to store each student or each row once we chop it up by commas. So we're going to chop each row up as using the commas as delimiters between each bit of data, and that's going to be stored in this temp student array, which is also a string. Now we need to iterate through a nested for loop to allow us to populate the two-dimensional array. And the way this is going to work is the outer loop is going to iterate through the rows, and then the inner loop is going to iterate through the columns. So for each row, it's going to iterate through each column in that row. And then it's going to move on to the next row and iterate through each column in that row. And that's the way a nested for loop works with a two-dimensional array. So whenever I'm going through the outer loop, I use the number of students as part of the condition, because the number of students is determined essentially the number of rows in my this array here, my temp student array. And then what I'm doing is, in this temp student array that I've created, I'm splitting the users in that particular row by the common delimiter. So for row 0, I'm splitting the data up using the commas and assigning each piece of data into a position in this temporary student array. Then the inner for loop, which allows me to allocate data to columns in a particular row, is then taking that data that's stored in the temporary student array and allocating it to, in the corresponding row in this two-dimensional array, it's allocating the data for from each column or each bit of info for that particular student to that corresponding column in the two-dimensional student array. So that process will repeat. It'll work its way down into the next row and across the columns, allocating each new student and their data to each new row in this two-dimensional array. Once that process is complete, you then have all your student data from your CSV file into an accessible working two-dimensional array that you can use throughout your program. And that is it.